Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through His infinite mercy, His child and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, redeemed, His child and forever I am. His child and forever I am.
The Church of Christ in Canada welcomes you to Key to the Kingdom. Today's lesson is entitled, Two Kinds of Food.
Thank you for joining us today as we continue in our study of the book of John. We're going to move on a couple of chapters, and our text will be taken from John chapter 6. Jesus, when He was on earth, did various miracles. In fact, His disciples and His servants did miracles as well. And even in the early days of the church, we had miracles being performed. All of these was for the purpose of making faith or building faith, helping people to believe that indeed, in this case, that Jesus is the Christ. And in the case of the disciples and apostles who did miracles, it had to do with proving or verifying that they were truthful, that the message they were giving was indeed the message that had come from God. Some of the miracles that Jesus did are noted in the New Testament, not all of them. John, in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, reminds us that there were many other miracles that were done by Jesus that aren't written in the book. In other words, He didn't talk about them all. And in fact, in reality, John talked about few compared to what Luke did, for example. But these were done, he says. These were written about so that we would have faith in Jesus. Miracles, by their very nature, inspire belief, I guess, and certainly inspire some amazement when someone is able to do a true miracle. In fact, today there are those people who we know as magicians who do miracles, supposedly, or at least amazing things that are beyond what we would expect that a man or woman ought to be able to do. But these are not real miracles, and certainly not biblical miracles. The miracles that Jesus did involved healing people who were ill instantaneously, raising people from the dead, that kind of thing. Here in John 6, we find a miracle. And it's an interesting miracle in the sense of its effects, and hopefully a miracle that teaches a good lesson in reference to food. We said at the beginning that the program's title today is Two Kinds of Food. And Jesus is going to talk about two kinds of food here in John chapter 6. Well, let's go to that chapter, verse 1 beginning, and read about this miracle that took place. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed Him because they saw the miraculous signs He had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with His disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. So here we have Jesus going about His teaching. He has come to the shore of the Sea of Galilee. There's a lot of people who are following Him. And notice the reason they're following Him. It says they're following Him because of the signs as He had performed on the sick, in the healing of the sick and that kind of thing. It was time for the Jewish Passover. Okay, let's go back to the text, verse 5. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward Him, He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy food for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Now, here's practical. Jesus says to Philip, "Where can we buy some food?" And Philip's response is, "We can't buy that much food. 8 months' wages wouldn't buy that much food, and we certainly don't have that kind of money." Well, it's interesting because go back to the reading, verse 8. Another of his apostles, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Now, you have to wonder a little bit, is Andrew, is he envisioning the possibilities of this being used to feed, or is he simply underlining what Andrew or what Philip has already said by pointing out we don't have the food, we don't have the money to buy the food we need, because this is all we've got. Here's a kid with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Well, verse 10, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Well, here's quite an amazing miracle. He is able to feed all of these people with 5 loaves and 2 small fish. And he didn't skimp on it. The text says that when they had had enough to eat. In other words, he didn't, ration it out and say, "Okay, you can have a bite of this and you can have a bite of that." But he gave them the bread they wanted. He gave them the fish they wanted. And with that, each one had enough to eat. Not only that, but when all was done, they gathered up what was left and filled 12 baskets with the food. Now the people, some of them at that point, just wanted to take Jesus and make him king. Here in verse 14, it says they believed. This was the miracle, and they believed that he was the prophet that was to come. Now, in their mind, they understood that this prophet that was going to come was going to establish a kingdom, or at least it was going to take the seat of leadership in the kingdom and rule over them. And so they said, "Okay, this is him. This is the guy. This has got to be the one we're looking for." And so they were going to take him immediately and make him king. Jesus understood that, and because of that, he goes away into the mountain. And so, an event that is pretty spectacular. Just think about that. If any of you have had a family dinner, quite often at holiday times, and I can remember back home in Thanksgiving times when the whole family would come together, and you might have 20 or 30 people gather together and have a meal and all of that. Well, it usually involved more than 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. And in fact, it was a major planning operation to decide what we're going to eat. Well, in fact, sometimes we had to figure out where we were going to eat. But in this case, they were in an area, in the outside. It was evidently good weather, so they were able to sit down. That wasn't a problem. But there had been no time for planning, no time to gather in food. And so it was an amazing miracle. Not the most amazing miracle that Jesus performed, but certainly right up there when you think about what was done with what he had been given to do it with. And of course, the effect that it had on the people. A miracle that brought faith. Now, perhaps in this case, the faith was somewhat wrongly directed in that the purpose of the miracle was to prove that he was indeed the fulfillment of Scripture. But then their interpretation of that Scripture and what it meant as far as his being a king made it so that it wasn't as all-encompassing as you would like for it to have been. Well, it's an interesting story, but the story doesn't end there. The events of the day don't end there. And in fact, if we were going to deal with the topic we've set for ourselves, 2 kinds of food, then really what are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about fish and bread, 2 kinds of food? Well, no. There's more to that, more to this event than that. So let's go back to the text. In my notes, I had originally said an interesting sidelight to the story, but really, it's not a sidelight. It's very much an important part of all that took place in this particular event. So let's go back to John 6 and begin reading at verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and sat off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Well, the excitement calms down. I guess people perhaps went back to their homes or perhaps even just gathered somewhere in that area where they had had the meal and spent time talking and thinking about the events. Jesus had gone off into the mountain to be alone. The disciples wanted to cross over to Capernaum, and so there's a boat, and they get in it, and off they go. Kind of an interesting thing when you think about it, because Jesus was with them. I mean, they didn't seem to check to see where he was or whether he wanted to go with them or whatever. They just got in the boat and off they went. Later on, as they're going across, they look out and here they see somebody walking on the water. And it frightened them. In fact, the text says they were terrified. But Jesus says, "Don't worry, it's just me. It's just I'm coming over." And so they let him in the boat, and very quickly they arrived at their destination. Well, the story doesn't end there either. Let's go back to the text, this time starting at verse 22. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth. You are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him, God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Well, you know, they're pretty understanding of what's going on, and they see when morning comes that Jesus isn't there and the apostles aren't there. Of course, they knew the apostles had gotten in this boat and left. And so they decided to go. There's some other boats came, so they went over to see what was going on. When they get there, they find Jesus there. And they ask him the question, "How did you get here?" Well, Jesus doesn't really answer the question. But he does talk with them and really challenges them by pointing out to them their shallow motives. They were interested in the food that Jesus could expand to feed the crowd. You know, when they came, they were interested in that. They were interested in that food that Jesus was able to produce. And so in verse 26 and 7, Jesus talks to them about the fact that you are looking for me simply because of the miraculous signs, or not because of the miraculous signs, but because of the loaves and your fill. The idea that really they're not coming because they're amazed at who he is, or perhaps even are all that interested in who he is, but they see him having the power to feed them. They, I think, like we are often, focused on the food which spoils, the food which doesn't last. And so as we talk about two kinds of food, the one kind of food we're talking about is physical food, like that bread, like those fish. Back in John chapter 4, remember Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well, centered around water that one could drink, but that wouldn't satisfy you for long. It wouldn't be long until you were wanting more. Many things that mankind holds as of great value are much the same as that food which Jesus says perishes or ceases after a while. It doesn't have the value that it did have. Perhaps it's the food of human wisdom. You know, human wisdom can only go so far, and we can only know so much. Maybe it's the food of laughter and pleasure. Or, I guess, in our society, one of the things that we really put high trust in is material wealth. And yet, the truth of the matter is that all of these things are only for a while. After a while, they wear out. After a while, they spoil. After a while, they don't accomplish for us what we think they should. When I think about this kind of thing, I'm always reminded of Solomon's word in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And let's start reading there in verse 3. Solomon says, "I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made great gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to house groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Well, from a strictly physical standpoint, Solomon had it made. He had everything he could want materially. In fact, he did not hold back anything that he wanted. If you were in the position that he was financially, and perhaps in the position of power that he was in, you could pretty well get whatever you wanted. Sometimes we look at our life and if we see people who are wealthy and it seems like they can just do anything and everything, we think, boy, they've really got it made. They have a great life of substance. And yet, the truth of the matter is that is food that perishes. It is food that satisfies for a while. The suggestion is made that he who loves money will never have enough. He who loves wealth will never be satisfied because he'll never have as much as he wants. When we spend our life simply trying to fulfill the joys of the flesh, that all passes by after a while. As we get older, we can't do or don't enjoy many of the things that we could do and maybe enjoyed in younger days. We start to wear out after a while. The food, the physical food of this life, pleasure, riches, those kinds of things, will lose their appeal because we can no longer do those things or live up to those things or enjoy some of those things that we enjoyed at different times. We need to labor for that food which lasts. We need to look for that food that provides not only for this life, but for eternity. Next week on Key to the Kingdom, we want to move on in this text from John chapter 6 and look at what Jesus has to say about the true food that blesses forever. Join us again at that time on Key to the Kingdom. We invite you to visit the Church of Christ in your area. In Edmonton, the church meets at 13015 116th Avenue. They worship at 10:30 on Sunday morning. They have Bible school at 9:30 on Sunday morning. And then on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m., they have Bible study. For information, you can call 780-455-1049. In Bengoff, Saskatchewan, the church meets east side of Highway 34 in the village of Bengoff. They meet for Sunday school at 10:30 and worship at 11:15. Norman Kemp is the contact there, and you can reach him at 306-268-4522. In Montreal, Quebec, the Ville-Émard Church meets at 6259 Monk Boulevard. That's 2 streets east of the Monk subway station, 10 minutes from downtown. They have a simultaneous electronic translation, and so you can hear the lessons in English, French, or Spanish. They meet at 10 o'clock for Sunday school Sunday morning, with worship at 11, and Bible study again on Wednesday evening at 7. Roger Shamur is the preacher there, and you can reach him at 514-765-8919. And their website is www.vecoc.org. The Way to Life is the title of the introductory lesson to our Bible course series. This course is available to you free for the asking. In the course, the first lesson gives an overview of the coming studies, as well as asks some general Bible questions. Following the intro course, you'll receive 6 booklets, each containing lessons on a given theme. For example, the first lesson is God has spoken. The second lesson, this is good news. When you look at the intro lesson at the back, you'll see the listing of the individual booklets that will come as you study each one, complete the study, and send it back to your study helper. We can provide this study in English, French, and Spanish, and we invite you to contact us, and we'll be happy to send it to you absolutely free of charge. You can call us at 1-800-795-3522. That's 1-800-795-3522. Or contact us through our website at www.keytothekingdom.ca. May God bless you in your study of His Word.
Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through His infinite mercy, His child and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, redeemed, His child and forever I am. His child and forever